Saturated fat, the fat that has been demonized for decades. Today, I'll tell you why consuming more saturated fat reduces inflammation. So, just that we are all on the same page, saturated fat, that's the kind of fat mostly found in butter, meat, eggs, all of the stuff that you're being told is so bad for you. Now, I want to get that mainstream idea right out of the way. Saturated fat does not cause heart disease. This is really what most studies have found. But I want to take a closer look at one of these studies, kind of review papers in particular, that looked at the history and our findings to this whole topic, saturated fat and heart disease. And by the way, realize that saturated fat and heart disease, this was based on a hypothesis. So something that has never been proven. Someone had this idea and thought, based on some data, well, maybe this causes heart disease. Turns out that's false. So I don't want to bore you with all of the stuff in the study, so I'm only going to read you a small part of the summary in that study. The idea that saturated fats cause heart disease, called the diet heart hypothesis, was introduced in the 1950s based on weak associational evidence. Subsequent clinical trials attempting to substantiate this hypothesis could never establish a causal link. So basically what they're saying is, even though we had this hypothesis and made a lot of studies on it, we didn't find any link. However, these clinical trial data were largely ignored for decades until journalists brought them up to light about a decade ago. Subsequent re-examinations of this evidence by nutrition experts have now been published in over 20 review papers, which, now pay close attention, have largely concluded that saturated fats have no effect on cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular mortality, or total mortality. So, saturated fats do not cause heart disease, and nobody wants to hear it. And I also linked two big other real studies in the description in case you don't really believe this. You can check it out. Now this time I do want to tell you, I know what's going on in the world right now. Listen, the information is out there and it has been out there for some time now. But I know your doctor, your TV, the people around you, they're still telling you to avoid saturated fat. Well, guess what? This is based on old science. We now have new science. And if you had been listening to what evolution told you, you would have never fallen into that trap. But first up, let's really find out why saturated fat doesn't cause heart disease and actually reduces inflammation. And we have to understand what fat really is. Fats are triglycerides. We are really talking about fat that gives you energy. Cholesterol, for example, is a lipid. It is not fat. It is something completely else. It doesn't give you energy. And it's not anything that I will focus on in this video. So the major fuel sources for us are either carbohydrates that break down to sugar or fats that break down into fatty acids. So realize, if you're eating carbohydrates, you're also eating sugar. For some people, this might be big news. Now triglycerides, which are fat again, have this glycerol backbone that you can see on this picture that holds 3 fatty acids. The fatty acids need to be cleaved off the backbone to be used for energy inside our mitochondria, the energy factories of our cells. So when you eat fat from, let's say, butter or other things in your diet, you eat it as triglycerides. And then your body, your liver uses bile and your pancreas uses an enzyme called lipase to cleave off these 3 fatty acid chains and use them for energy, for example. Now, saturated fatty acids only have these single bonds that you can see on this picture here. And every carbon is sort of saturated with 2 hydrogen atoms. This, however, would be an unsaturated fatty acid. See how it makes a curve and has these double bonds. This is basically the difference here. Now, how does saturated fat decrease inflammation? First up, you have to understand fat is essential to us, very different from carbohydrates. Basically, we don't really need carbohydrates. One of the major things we need fat for is our cell membranes. Remember, you are a multicellular organism, meaning you're made of trillions and trillions of cells that work in unison. Now, each one of these cells needs a membrane. And this membrane is kind of like a wall separating it from the bloodstream and other cells around it. Let's take a look at it in depth. Cell membranes are made of phospholipids. These phospholipids have a head consisting of a phosphate group and glycerol and a long fatty acid chain. So that is where fat finally comes into play. Here you can see how it works. The outside of the cell is mostly water, just like the inside. But you don't want this kind of water mixing because there are different things in those waters. Now the fatty acid group rejects the two different waters from mixing. So the outside can't go into the inside and the inside can't go into the outside. Why? Because fat doesn't mix with water. And remember, we're talking about fat here. Fatty acids doesn't mix with water. Actually kind of interesting how this works, right? The key point is the fat that you consume ends up in your phospholipids. So if you consume a lot of saturated fat, it's going to end up in your phospholipid. If you consume a lot of unsaturated fat, this is what your phospholipids are then made of. Now, saturated fat is the best fat for your membranes. Why? Because they are most stable against heat and oxidation. So basically your cell membranes can break under certain circumstances. And these circumstances can, for example, be heat from the sun or the energy, the heat being emitted from your mitochondria, basically a byproduct of energy metabolism. And there are other things that can make your cell membranes oxidize faster, but you just want to have the best fat around your cells, obviously. You want to supply your cells with the best building blocks that you can basically get from your diet. Now, what are your cell membranes most likely made of? Polyunsaturated fatty acids. Remember these fatty acids with the double bonds or weird shapes we talked about earlier? To be even more specific, omega-6 fatty acids, and to be even more specific, linoleic acid, because this type of fat is almost impossible to avoid these days. And most people have this in their body at the moment. You have that in your body. So what's so bad about this fat? Compared to the saturated fatty acids, these fatty acids are very prone to heat and oxidation and damage. And what happens when you get damage to the cell membranes? Well, they can break, and then the inside, for example, can leak outside into your bloodstream. And then your body has to get rid of these junk materials and you just lost a cell. Not really what we want. So how can you correct this? Realize you now have all of your cells, or maybe not all of them, but a lot of them made out of this linoleic acid. So it takes a few months or maybe even years to correct this. But don't worry, once you start it, you're gonna feel better and better, and you're gonna reduce inflammation over time. The first thing you're gonna have to do is avoid modern junk oils that are unnatural. So you've gotta avoid cancer, basically. If you don't want cancer, stop consuming it. For example, seed oils. You can see these seed oils on this list here. This is, by the way, the oil that you've been told is so much better for your heart. But now we know that saturated fat isn't bad for your heart. And now you're finding out this information. And this has got to make you mad at some point. Now your cell membranes are made out of this crap because everyone's telling you saturated fat is so bad for you. Guess what? Not true. So you've got to avoid the canola oil, the cottonseed oil, the soybean oil, the sunflower seed oil, all of this crap that they're using in restaurants and that every single household is using. Another thing you want to avoid is conventional meat, especially chicken, this poultry. Conventional beef is a bit fine because it somehow compensates for it. It kind of has a limit of how much omega-6 it can have. But you have to understand, they're made mostly out of saturated fat until you give these animals unnatural feed. And this is what we are doing all the time now. All of your supermarket meat is full of polyunsaturated fatty acids, high in omega-6, because we give them soy, GMO corn, all of this stuff, and that raises their polyunsaturated fatty acid content, but even worse, their omega-6 content. So I want you to consume more grass-fed meat, especially beef is a very good decision. And you can kind of counteract omega-6. Now that you have it so much, you need to consume more fish, which is high in omega-3. This is also a polyunsaturated fatty acid, true, but this is kind of gonna balance out the omega-6. And then you just have the saturated fat, which doesn't have to be balanced out in any way. It's just saturated fat, which is then good for your cell membranes. And by the way, now that you know this, that conventional meat is not so good for you, you always want to avoid seed oils. And it's true, conventional meat is not perfect, but if you can't afford high quality meat, at least go for some conventional meat. I would recommend beef here, or some high quality fat that you can maybe afford, because you've got to realize if you now cut down on all the fat, you can't make new cell membranes. And this is probably even worse than consuming seed oils, which is also very bad, because now you can't even really make new cells. What organ is most dependent on new cell membranes, new cells? Well, I'm already pointing at it. It's your brain. So low fat diets, extremely low fat diets, will cause brain damage to some degree at some point. Now we are at the end of this video, and I do want to say I do consultings around health. You can check all of that out in the video description on my website. And then I wish you a great day and see you in the next one.